Hi, welcome. I'm Nate Ostick, and this is Conservation Nebraska's webinar on solar and wind energy in Nebraska. We have John Hay, who's an extension educator at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's done a lot of work researching and learning about utility scale wind and solar energy here in Nebraska. He has a really cool presentation for us today, and I'm just going to hand it over to him. If you have any questions throughout the course of this, you can put them into the little box which says Q&A. At the end, we'll be able to go through those and kind of get those answered for you guys. So, John, if you'd like, please take it away.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody. Looks like we have a good group here tonight. People that are joining live can, I suppose, get the benefit of asking questions, and people seeing this in recording will have to send me an email or something. So welcome everybody. Nate asked me to talk about wind and solar in Nebraska, and I'm going to attempt to do that at some level. I come at it from a different place than others, but in some cases I think that can be good because I don't work for a utility and I don't work for a developer. Sometimes I can look at this big picture and try to see this from perspectives, multiple perspectives, including the perspective of potential landowners, also of landowners who might be leasing land, neighbors that might be around these developments, as well as trying to understand the utilities perspective as well and why they may be wanting to invest in these types of opportunities. So we're going to be talking about kind of what's happening in the industry. I really shortened my presentation today from what I usually give, but we'll hit the high points and go ahead and ask your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to those, and there may be some time for Q&A at the end. So we're going to try to talk a little bit about kind of form and function of solar and wind a little bit at utility scale. We're going to talk about the marketplace a little bit and the changing laws. And if we get to it, we're going to get into the kind of some of the drivers of why this is happening more and more, if we can get there. I found this article today, and I found it interesting and kind of wanted to bring it up, which this is just an article from there's an article about this graphic written in the Yale Climate Connections newsletter that came out today. But what is interesting is this is kind of the renewable electricity generated in each state. And I think what's kind of interesting is that this renewable electricity at the highest states, you know, in South Dakota and Vermont and Washington and Idaho and Montana, some of those highest ones, really defies a little bit, you know, what we might think of as any political motivation going on in there. But what's happening in many ways in those states is they have large amounts of hydroelectric. So with large amounts of hydroelectric and then a little bit of renewables in wind and solar, they can get very high numbers. I think maybe more importantly in this graphic are states like Iowa, and then maybe even Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, I think are interesting because these are states that really, Iowa in some cases policy, but particularly Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, where the price of the renewables, particularly wind power, and partially because it was subsidized, really drove large amounts of development and large amounts of adoption that was really based on their ability to have low-cost electricity from that because it was low cost and because the subsidies helped drive it even lower. So kind of interesting stuff going on. And then you kind of see the Southeast. And again, what's happening in the East and Southeast, I think, is really just a lack of wind resource. They desire, I think, in some cases, some renewables, but they don't have the good wind resource. And solar is a growing resource, but the prices are only coming down now to where we're seeing large scale developments. So kind of interesting things happening there. I wanted to clarify really quick. There's really two different scales when we're talking about wind and solar. There is utility scale or grid scale, and then there's distributed, which sometimes I describe as behind the meter. Now, if you're wanting solar or wind at your home, particularly solar at your home or your farm or your business, that's going to be distributed behind the meter, and the policies are completely different than the policies at the utility scale. Today, I am talking about utility scale. So these policies have to do with these big ones. I have whole other presentations. If you want, you can go to my website and find them that are about the distributed systems if you're interested in those. Very, very different set of policies. And what we're talking about today doesn't necessarily apply to those. The form and function does a little bit, but not a lot. So, I cut back on these slides quite a lot, but I wanted to give a sense of what we're talking about with large scale wind and solar. Large scale wind turbines are just that, very, very large. They have a tower. The nacelle is the piece on the top. A grown person could stand up in there. It's like the size of a bus, so it's quite large. Very large blades, and very, very large systems, and they cost maybe $4 to $6 million each. Very, very expensive to install, but generate a lot of electricity. Here's a picture of the foundation going in. There's different types of foundations. This is the most common foundation type you're going to see in Nebraska. I think one thing I'm jumped this ahead to talk about decommissioning, because here I'm showing them building it, and then I'm going to jump and talk about decommissioning, which in the event 20 to 40 years from now, when this particular wind turbine is being decommissioned, they're going to cut just the top of this concrete chunk off, and they're likely going to leave it in the ground. And what dictates that is what's in the contract for the particular landowner. They're going to dictate what exactly they're going to do. Some people are worried about not having money, like company going bankrupt, things like that. There's a couple things going on in the state of Nebraska that deal with that. One is that if there is a local decommissioning policy in place from there's a zoning rule or something in that county, they follow that. And so a county could say there must be money set aside to take this down, and it must be set aside in year 1 or year 15 or year 10 of the project. If the county does not have such a policy, there is a state law that says that a decommissioning security must be put in place in year 10 of the project. That's for both wind and solar. So just there is a little bit of law that's kind of dictating how these are, at least some level of protection to try to have some money available for decommissioning if the company doesn't do it. Some road work typically needs to be done when these are being installed to make sure the roads are good enough to handle the equipment. So that's all dealt with the county. So I have lots of stuff about the physics of wind turbines, but what it comes down to is that wind turbines are not going to become smaller, because to gather the electricity, or gather the wind and turn it into rotational energy and into electrical energy, the laws of physics really dictate that wind turbines need to be big. They need to be tall where they're up in the wind, and that's the way it's going to be. We're not going to all of a sudden see a bunch of small wind turbines generating lots of electricity. They don't have access to the wind. We need to access that power in the wind, so we have to be big, we have to be tall. Efficiency is not likely going to get a lot better. I think they've made really big strides in efficiency, and there's going to be some incremental changes of efficiency in the future, but robustness can improve where we reduce the maintenance, reduce the cost of maintenance. They run longer and quieter. Those types of things, which I'm kind of describing as robustness, can improve over time. But we have really long-lasting and well-made wind turbines today, but there's always improvements to be made, but the efficiency improvements are going to be, I think, pretty incremental.
Hey, John. So
Yes.
we have a question from Tom Handelman. So they leave the base in the ground when a turbine is decommissioned, but what's happening to the rest of the turbine?
The metal parts, which are the tower, the generator itself, and other things, are going to be recycled because they can be and have value. The wind turbine blades, at least the moment in time now in 2022, 23, those wind turbine blades are made out of fiberglass and resin. That's a really low value product, and so they don't have a lot of value. So essentially right now they're being cut into pieces and landfill. That's a challenge. I don't necessarily see that as a deal breaker in anything other than it makes wind turbines imperfect, just like every other energy system. Part of the imperfect nature of it, they have some solid waste at the end of their life. We would love to see more recycling, and I think that may happen some in the future, but the reality is fiberglass and resin is pretty low quality and really pretty inert, so it's being landfilled at the moment. So that's kind of a frustration with wind turbine blades, but the rest of it is recycled because it has value as steel and metal and other things. So good question. Solar is a little different ball game. The primary chemistries we're talking about in solar are silicon, monocrystalline, polycrystalline are the two most common on the market today. We're starting to see a little bit of this cadmium telluride, which is just a little different chemistry, come in to play. Both the monocrystalline and the polycrystalline have pretty high efficiency, long lifespans of 25 to 30 years. The monocrystalline are a little bit more expensive, but they're also a little more efficient. We are seeing efficiencies in the really 20 to 24% range, which doesn't sound super high, but is pretty amazing when we're turning something that is free, like sunlight, directly into electricity with no moving parts at a rate of 25% efficiency. There are some solar cells out there that are reaching 40% efficiency. Those are very expensive, and they're typically manufacturing those to put up in space at the moment. But that does give us at least some hint that the future can move forward and keep increasing those efficiencies. There's really two different types of racking systems. There are stationary fixed tilt racking systems that sit facing south and just don't move. In Nebraska, about a 35-degree tilt angle is pretty close to optimum. And this is a solar farm that's actually in Ohio, but there's not a lot of large fixed tilt systems in Nebraska I can get pictures of, but I have one from a cohort of mine in Ohio. What's most common in the industry today is called a one-axis tracking. And one-axis tracking face east in the morning. The sun comes up and gets right into that solar panel right early in the morning, and then they track the sun across the sky, and in the evening are facing west. And then as the sun goes down, then they reset to center for the middle of the night, and they come back to east in the morning. And so those are moving parts. And actually in this picture, you can see one of them kind of out in the back that's facing the wrong way because something temporarily broke down. So that there is maintenance on those, but they do increase the power output. So it's pretty important. Those are really good for large scale. Still for small scale, I don't recommend moving parts, but for large scale, that's the state of the industry is a one-axis tracking system. And here's the deal. The one-axis tracking does better because it gets more of the morning sun and that afternoon sun. And so you kind of call it the shoulders of the day. That's why one-axis tracking produces quite a bit more electricity per day than a fixed tilt, but has moving parts that needs maintained. For decommissioning, the state law is the same as the wind, which is that we follow county rules unless there is none, and in which case the state law kicks in. One good piece, I suppose, of solar is the sense that there's no concrete in the ground. They simply take these I-beams and drive them into the ground very precisely, both in location and depth. So theoretically, if we take those out at some point in the future, they just simply, take a machine out there that pulls them out, and you don't leave any concrete in the ground. And so that's a good piece of solar. They are different in the sense that it's much more difficult to farm the land. Wind, I can put a wind turbine up, it takes a small amount of land, but I farm the rest of that farm. Solar, in general, we're going to plant the state of the industry is to plant that to grass and then mow it once or twice a year, and that's it. So it's not really conducive to agriculture, but it can be conducive on a monetary income for a farmer to lease it. And that's why there is interest in landowners leasing that, because they can get a good income off of that lease. A couple of videos on the physics if you want. There's one on solar and there's one on wind. on my YouTube page. So give that a check out if you want to know more about the physics of wind turbines. All right, let's get into this kind of political trend. Go ahead.
We had a couple more questions here about the solar field. So, is land farmable usually after having a solar field on it? Like after it's been decommissioned?
Yes, that's a good question. I finally found the Q&A so I can read them too. But yes, it would be farmable in this, and actually, it's probably not a bad thing for the land, because if you can imagine, I'm putting a perennial crop, even if it's just grass, on that land for a long period of time, 20 to 30, maybe 40 years. And so that land is probably slowly gaining carbon because it's photosynthesizing, but we're not taking anything off from a harvesting crop standpoint. So, and we're not tilling it. Tilling is very detrimental to soil. So it probably is in decent shape at the end and could easily go back to be farmable. So now I think there's some concerns. There's some considerations, how much did I take heavy equipment in there to take all that stuff out? Did I do any compaction, which would cause me some multi-year damage before, but that doesn't stop me from farming it. It just has some damage there at the end. So good question, and definitely it's farmable after. Why don't you go and read the rest of those?
All right. Well. So we'll get this other one before turning back to the couple of them. We had one that was, is there a potential trend to elevate the panels and then grow shade-tolerant produce beneath them? That's from Steve Roth.
Yeah, Steve, there's absolutely a research trend and the industry is really interested in it, because it is a cost to them to maintain the vegetation under the solar. And wouldn't it be nice if we could gain a value from that, and that actually was a positive? A lot of work in it. Now, what I don't see though is the near term, I don't see the solar industry wanting to change I'm going to call it their architecture, because as they put those solar panels in, any change to make them taller or farther apart costs them money, and I don't see a near term of them wanting to do that. But in the long term, as we learn more about growing things under these, which there's a lot of research going on, I think it is possible to start seeing that. Right now, what can happen is grazing of sheep, but grazing of sheep, I think, is we got to be a little careful in thinking about that, because if we put in a solar farm of 1,000 acres and we say we're going to graze sheep, we don't have enough sheep for 1,000 acres in a county. And so in many counties in Nebraska. So that's going to be a challenge to say we're going to graze all of it, but grazing portions of it is very possible. So yeah, a lot of work, but I don't think that really the industry has come along to really get on board with that happening yet. And I think they're dragging their feet for some legitimate reasons. One of which is safety. There's very high voltage going on in there, and I think they want to be really careful about saying that we're going to have people inside that fence for doing anything that's not have to do with the solar array. So good question. Thanks for that.
And finally, we have two, one from Alexander and the other one from Sherry. They're both asking about what's the average lifespan of wind turbines, and about how long are those going to last? Is there being work towards making them last longer?
I think there's a lot of interest all the time in making things last longer, because then I have less maintenance, I have less cost. Wind turbines right now, in any power plant, you have a power plant, they're going to say this is its lifespan. That doesn't mean we destroy the power plant after, but it does mean that they think it'll run that long without some really major changes. And right now for a wind turbine, that's 20 years. So this is going to last 20 years. That doesn't mean it couldn't last 25 or longer, or maybe they couldn't do some repowering. but those are kind of unknowns. So to say the goal is for that to last 20 years, the two wind turbines north of Lincoln have gotten old. And actually, both of them now are over 20 years old, and they're going to probably last till they're about 25. And then the utility has to make a decision, and it could be the end of them. But they lasted 25 years. So they are at least a test bed of successful longevity anyway on those wind turbines. So we'll see what happens. That's the plan for blades. You know, getting blades to last a long time has a lot to do with the design, but also how much lightning do they get struck by and other things. So blades are going to be a repair issue for wind turbines forever, because it's one of the parts that flexes and moves. And but yeah, I think they're going to try to get them to last as long as they can.
Then we're going to take this one more from Sharon, and then do more questions after this next section. Is the heat or reflection from solar panels, is that detrimental to humans or animals and part of a danger for that?
Yeah, I'm going to ask, I see Sharon has another question too. I'll answer both. The answer with heat or reflection is actually no, it's not an issue, but part of that is to think about what was happening. I have a solar panel, it is absorbing light and turning 20% of that into electricity that's not heat. So only 80% of the heat is there. Yes, it's getting warm. And if I was to reach up and touch it, it would be warm. But that's really no different than anything else that's warm. The shingles on my roof that are just absorb 100%, most, not quite 100, but almost 100% of the energy and get hot, or a bare soil that gets hot. So it actually isn't really all that detrimental, and underneath is the shade. And then when they graze sheep under those, the sheep will congregate under the solar panel in the shade where it is cooler, because they're being blocked from the sun. And as long as there's, they're not a couple inches from it, they won't feel the warmth from the solar panels. So the other one is hail. And just like, yes, of course, they are susceptible to hail, but they're actually quite tough. And they, in many cases, they'll handle most hailstorms we get. But if we had a really bad one that was baseball or softball size, then the insurance company gets involved, because likely we're going to lose some panels. But if it is more golf ball size or smaller, they'll likely survive it. There's been many examples of roof mounted solar where the roof needed replaced, but the solar panels did not. And that's pretty common, because the solar panels are pretty tough. Not completely. They'll still break with big ones, but they're pretty tough.
All right, and we had one little quick one here from Marvin asking for the decommissioning rules. Is that taking into account the expected lifespan of turbine units?
Decommissioning rules written in the county / the state, I think, I don't know this 100% of why they said 10 years, the state, when they wrote the law. But I have some thought that they were trying to kind of make some kind of a balance between the wind developer and the protection of the people. And I think they did that. They did that by saying, well, it doesn't have to be in year 1. It can be in year 10. But a lot of times these systems have a 20-year power purchase agreement, so they have a contract to run for 20 years. So that 10 years is well within that time frame. But it wasn't in year 1 where they'd put a bunch of money up front when they hadn't made much income yet. That's where a county might take a different philosophy and say, well, but we're worried about something happening earlier, and we're going to have it be earlier, or something like that. So different counties can do different things. But yes, I think the lifespan is taken into account, but also the contracts, and also the likelihood of default maybe, and things like that. So there is just some examples of wind turbines that were not taken down and have been unfunctional in Southern California, and that kind of put a black eye on the industry a little bit. And I think that's where some of the fear is from. and rightly so. So they've tried to put these different protectionist measures in place. Yes, yeah, Alexander said, yeah, feel free to email me. I'll have my email here at the end of the presentation. And feel free to email me to chat, or we can get in a discussion that way. So look forward to it. All right, let's see where we can go here. Let's get into what happened in Nebraska. And Nate, before we got started, said, I'm curious why Iowa has more wind turbines than Nebraska. I said, well, Nate, it doesn't have to do with wind resource. We have a better wind resource than Iowa, but lots of things happened and that made that different. So here's kind of a story about that. Pre-2007, there were no private utility scale private renewable developments in Nebraska. There were some public developments, but not private. And the reason was that the state's eminent domain laws with respect to public power really made it not a good business decision for a private company to come in and try to put a wind farm in, because the public utility could take that under eminent domain. So they weren't going to do it. Secondly, the public companies weren't building very many wind farms or solar because they couldn't get the tax credit. And if they couldn't get the tax credit, the electricity costs more. So the Nebraska senators at the time in the legislature really were interested in the economic development of renewables and had to ask themselves a question: how to allow for private wind development in Nebraska, and they wanted to still maintain Nebraska as a public power state. So not deregulate to let the private companies in, but to write laws that let the private companies in. So then we have to go through this chain of events that happened after they asked themselves that question. First, prior to 2007, the public utility could build a renewable system. We saw that 4 different times. LES built 2 wind turbines, OPPD built 1, the Municipal Energy Agency of Nebraska built a small wind farm at Kimball, and NPPD built a small wind farm at Ainsworth. And then it kind of stopped, the development. Those were kind of test beds. We'll see how this goes. And then it stopped. The native tribes or nations have always had the ability to do this, but not necessarily a reason to. Plus, they couldn't access the tax credit either, so we don't see any examples of them building at utility scale. They have some small scale developments, but not utility scale. So the first law that changed in 2007, they called the Community-Based Energy Development Law, CBED. Basically, in short, if there's Nebraska ownership, then the state would allow the development and then waive the eminent domain power from that and allow for that development. That was LB 629 in 2007. There were 2 developments from that law, one at Bloomfield, one at Crofton. And then really development slowed. There wasn't a large appetite for Nebraska ownership because these are very expensive and people weren't in that business. So there was really slow. So they started to think about, the legislature started to think about other ways. So they wrote another law that said if the private developer had a long-term power purchase agreement, PPA, power purchase agreement, with a public utility, then they would waive the eminent domain authority and let that development happen. That law passed in 2009, and essentially all the developments in Nebraska came after that, really based on that predominantly. So that was a big change. The biggest law change actually happened in 2010 with LB 1048. LB 1048 sometimes is known as a law that allowed for export of wind energy, essentially saying a Nebraska private wind farm could sell electricity out of state to, let's say, someplace in Kansas or Oklahoma or South Dakota or whatever. But LB 1048 also did a lot of other things. So I actually have a whole slide just for LB 1048 because it was such a big deal. Some other small legislation that happened later on, there was some tax incentive legislation, but it's reasonably it's not quite as big and important. Some of it was if you had a project over 20 million, you got some sales tax if you hired Nebraska engineers and things like that. And then they extended that to seabeds the year after that. LB 1048. It first allowed for electricity to be sold out of state. It had this kind of weird 90-10 provision, which said 90% had to be, or 10% had to be offered for sale in state, and 90% could be out of state. And then they also required that it had to have a PPA. Both of those have since been altered, those two provisions in the bottom by LB 24, basically getting rid of the 90-10 provision and saying they don't have to have a PPA. They can sell it to the spot market if they want to. The next part of LB 1048 was really important. It changed the way wind turbines are taxed in the state of Nebraska. It made wind turbines exempt from personal property tax, but instead added a nameplate capacity tax. And actually that's a pretty good move, because what it did is instead of having a tax that could be depreciated and the tax goes away for the county, now you have a nameplate capacity tax that is paid every year for the life of the system. And so instead of gaining those taxes in a windfall for a couple of years and then they're gone, now it's a nice trickle all the way through the life of the system. And that's both for wind and for solar. Now, and it's $3,518. I think I have a slide on that later, but if I don't, we just simply take the megawatt outrated output of the system and multiply it times 3,518. That's what the county gets for taxes every year, just paid just like it was property taxes, or essentially it ends up in the same place as if it were property taxes. They put this decommissioning security in place that I mentioned before. And then finally, they provide a way for public power utilities or public power entities to eminent domain land for transmission to serve a private wind export facility. What was interesting is that passed in 2010 without any comments, but about 2 years ago, the legislature made lots of comments about that. And we're trying to change that. What they ended up doing is they ended up adding 2 words to that piece of the legislation or piece of the law, and saying that essentially the law says that it's a public good. Wind turbines, because of their economic development, I'm paraphrasing, is for the public good, and so it can have this eminent domain thing for transmission. And they said that it is a rebuttable presumption that it's for the public good, which allows a landowner who wants to challenge this, they can say, well, I challenge that it is for the public good, and they can then have at least some ability to challenge that. So that's kind of an interesting kind of trend or a chain of events of how that happened. They did some safety stuff about painting and lighting of wind measurement towers, which are there before the wind turbines ever show up. That was a big deal for safety of low-flying aircraft. So essentially in Nebraska, the state legislatures did this to allow for this development. And I think that it's important to kind of maybe think through what they were thinking about when they say this is for economic development or for good things. They were interested in the tax income for sure. They were interested in the jobs. For wind, it's about 10 permanent jobs per wind farm. For solar, it's more like 5 permanent jobs per solar farm for these large scale. Not a lot of jobs, but they are jobs and they tend to be good paying. Low cost electricity. I do accept that this point is complex to say that it's low cost, but I think what's important is that the power purchase agreements that have been offered in the last 10 years for wind, particularly wind and now solar starting the last year or two, are low enough that they are attracting attention of the utilities, and utilities are contracting for that for a number of reasons. So I've had people say, well, it's not low cost, and look at this and look at that. And I said, well, I agree in some ways, but look at the data and look at what our utilities, who are very fiscally responsible are doing, and they're buying this because they think they have a low price. And so there's some of that happening. I think that's important to understand. Now, the subsidies are part of that. Absolutely, we want to understand that that's part of it. Okay, let's get into some drivers. That's going to be interesting. I mean, I had a slide that said, you know, Nebraska has good wind, but I don't have to tell most Nebraskans that. We have good wind resources here. The things that are driving wind and solar development in the state are the cost of the electricity, the low cost of that electricity, the renewable energy standards or the environmental benefits of those, and then finally private companies. So if we look at this, this is a really complex slide, but let's start up here at the top. If we are looking at the levelized cost of electricity for new resources entering service 5 years from now, or 2027, 5 years from when this was written. And it came out in 2022. So if we were building some new resources and we were only interested in cost and then having something so that we have some reliability, we should probably think of reliability first, cost second, but we need some dispatchable technologies that we can turn on all the time when we need them. We can handle some resource constraints, some resources that aren't available to us all the time, as long as they're low cost. So if we just went through this list, coal, $82 a megawatt hour, much more expensive than combined cycle, probably natural gas at $39 a megawatt hour. Nuclear is expensive, 88 is what they're predicting here. Geothermal is low, but geothermal has less location availability, so that's a challenge. Biomass is expensive. So of the dispatchable technologies, I'm picking combined cycle natural gas. Of the resource constrained technologies, onshore wind and solar look pretty darn good compared to the rest. And then if we add the subsidy of about $25 for the first 10 years, not for the life of it, but the first 10 years, that's $15 and $12. Wind and solar are looking really, really, and they were competitive without the subsidy. Now they're really competitive. So when we look at the future of what utilities are going to be interested in, I'm predicting, but I'm predicting with some good data here, combined cycle natural gas, wind, and solar, and then there might throw in a combustion turbine, which is expensive, but we're going to run it very little, or throw in some batteries, but run them, but try to get their utilization up to try to make sure our reliability is all there. But these are kind of what I think might be happening if price is what's driving us. If environmental things are driving us, now, not every state has rules about environmental that drive, but some do. But if environmental is driving, we want to pick resources that have low emissions per unit energy. Now, you might hear that wind is 0 or solar is 0. Well, that's not true. Just like an electric car will advertise itself as a 0 emissions vehicle, and it is if we draw a box around the car, because the car doesn't give off any emissions. But remember, and we all know this, we had to fuel the car, and we fueled from the grid, which is a mix of resources. So the same is true for wind and solar. These numbers are life cycle numbers, from the mining of resources and the building of the solar panels and the wind turbines all the way through to their end. And if I take all of the emissions from that life cycle and I divide it by how many kilowatt hours it generated in its life cycle, I can have utility scale wind at 4 to 9. Remember, coal is close to 1,000, 900, 940 to 960. So round that to 1,000. While wind is under 10 and solar is 5 to 15, essentially, grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So very, very low. Not 0, but very, very low compared to the resources that are fossil fuels. Coal, natural gas, combined cycle natural gas is much better. And then I do have, this is last time I looked up this data, it's like 2017 data, but Nebraska's mix is 628. And so again, if I'm charging my car from Nebraska's grid, I'm not charging it from coal 100%. I'm not charging it from wind 100%. I'm charging it from a mix, and we're at 628 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So wind and solar can drive down our emissions, and watch is if that is a interest, of course, so can nuclear and hydro. If that is of interest to a state and makes rules accordingly, that can be some of the driving influence. The last important one, and I can get done with my comments so we can go to more questions, but the last one is private companies. And so I'm going to point out Facebook here. Facebook says they want 100% renewable energy by 2020. What does that have to do with Nebraska? Well, what that has to do with Nebraska is this headline: Facebook data center to be powered by $430 million wind farm in Nebraska. Now, powered is a weird word. It's not that they're powered directly or run directly from that wind farm. What they basically said is, we're going to use this many kilowatt hours a year, and we want to make sure that we own or is designated to us new generation that generates that same amount of kilowatt hours that is 100% renewable. So they basically worked with OPPD to buy into a wind farm so that that generation of wind onto the grid is counted as theirs, and they are 100% renewable on a net basis. So it's not on any instant in time basis, but it's a net basis. And so it's correct. And if you get into their details, they'll explain that. They're not trying to hide what they are. But here is a private company that basically said to OPPD, we want this to happen, and OPPD helped them make that happen. And so that wind farm was built essentially because of a private company who drove that demand for renewables. And that is happening more and more across the United States and in Nebraska. And it's happening more than just as Facebook. There's some more developments happening in Nebraska that are being asked for by private companies. Let's touch on the Inflation Reduction Act to finish, because this is really important. This is a big change in federal law that happened in 2022. And it did a couple things. It reestablished the tax credit for small systems. The small systems tax credit was fading away, and it reestablished it for 10 more years at 30% investment tax credit. Investment means I spent the money, I get the tax credit. For commercial, large scale, commercial, in this case, utility scale, it put in place either an investment tax credit or a production tax credit. So I can take the money all up front, or I can take it per unit of energy delivered. And for larger systems, it becomes better to do this production tax credit, so that the larger systems use the production tax credit, smaller tend to use the investment tax credit. And then after 2025, there's kind of throws a wrench in the subsidy works. That's kind of interesting, and I'll show you that in just a second. The investment tax credit, and actually there's, I think, maybe some of the rules for the production tax credit are written into this too. It says some things. You don't get the tax credit automatically. This is for larger systems, remember, kind of commercial scale, but not the really big ones. Those usually take the production tax credit. But anyway, you get only 6% guaranteed. You get 30% if you pay prevailing wages and hire apprentices and other things like that. You can get additional bonus tax credits if you use domestically made materials, made in the USA, solar panels, etc. So there's a lot of now new companies interested in trying to build in the United States to take advantage of that. If you build in low income or fossil reliant communities, if you sell in a community solar project, particularly to low income families, you could get these extra little 10% bonuses. This can be difficult to get some of these, but we'll see what happens when they write all the final rules. The production tax credits be the main way these large scale wind and solar take the tax credit. Is good through 2024, but then remember then they're going to change some things, and there's going to be some tax credits after that, but it just changes things a little bit. Again, the base amount is a third of a cent per kilowatt hour, but if they do the prevailing wages and apprentices, it goes 5 times. That's 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And then there's some inflation adjustments that make that about 2.6 cents per kilowatt hour. Well, that's pretty significant. And that's a very significant tax credit, and they get it for 10 years of the project. So those tax credits are really, these were competitive before. Now they look really good. Now, after 2025, beginning in 2025 and going forward, the Congress basically kind of changed this whole thing up. They said, wind and solar are great, but what we really want and what our real goal is to reduce the carbon emissions. So if a company can generate electricity without carbon emissions, they can get a tax credit. It's not about whether it's called wind or solar. It's about reducing our emissions. And so wind and solar will still qualify. But if a coal-fired power plant, for example, was able to capture their carbon dioxide and sequester it in geological storage, they might be able to access it as well. So if that technology of carbon capture and storage becomes feasible, here we go. They're going to incentivize them as well. We'll see how much that happens. That technology is a challenge. And I think there's a lot of excitement, but there's not a lot of it happening. So we'll see what happens with that. And it's basically more of a technology neutral policy, saying we're not going to try to judge now on who's the winner and loser. We just want it to be low carbon. A couple more slides and I'm done with the Inflation Reduction Act. This one is important, but I'm not going to touch on all of it. Some interconnection costs now qualify. Some energy storage like batteries qualify, even if they're not charged by renewables, because batteries are good for the grid and the reliability of the grid. And using renewables on the grid, batteries will help that. Transferability, I can transfer tax credits, but this direct pay is the most interesting to Nebraska at the moment, I think. Because before you had to be a tax-paying entity to get the subsidy, the tax credit. Well, that makes sense. But it left a lot of groups out, nonprofits, public utilities, things like that. And so now if those non-tax-paying entities, tax-exempt entities, build a solar or a wind or something like that, they can get a direct payment in lieu of the tax credit, which that could be interesting because in Nebraska, we have a lot of public utilities that before were needing to work with a private company. Now they might be able to do some of this on their own. And I think there's a lot of interest in that. So watch for your public utilities to be building wind and solar that they own and operate. Also nonprofits, thinking about nonprofit kind of companies, or we'll call it companies that have a location and maybe they wanted a little bit of solar on their building to reduce costs or something, but they couldn't get the tax credit before, so the economics didn't look good. Churches could be an interesting one as well, where all of a sudden it's going to be a better, very likely have a better economics than they did before. So we'll see how that works out. That'll be interesting. Clean hydrogen and nuclear tax credit, I'm not going to touch on those other than to say that there are some tax credits for those in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's some dollars for permitting and siting. One that's been kind of interesting to me in recent weeks is that the U.S. Department of Ag Rural Energy for America program got a lot more dollars put in through this bill, and also they're able to now raised the cost share from, it used to be 25%. They actually just recently, the legislation said 50% could be the maximum, but USDA Rural Development adopted a 40% maximum. But that's still very exciting for, these are for rural energy systems, like a farm solar or something like that. There's some grants that now are funded better and are up to 40%. I think I'm going to leave it there. There's a lot of complex questions that we didn't ask that I do have, and I'll necessarily maybe I'll leave it on this page for a second. A lot of those things are about noise and about property values and about different types of sound. What else? Lots of other fun research that's out there and kind of interesting on how complex these issues are. I put a link to all these scientific papers on my website, bioenergy.unl.edu, so you can check those out and learn quite a lot about kind of what the research says about noise and property values and other things like that. So
Yeah,
with that, I'll just go to my last slide so you can see it, and then we'll just go to as many questions as we can till we're done.
Yeah, we'll do a couple of Q&As here, but before we get into that, and as we're doing that, I'm going to launch a feedback survey. It's real short, so if you guys, I would really appreciate if you guys could fill it out. But we can get into the first question here while you guys are filling it out. Mina asks, how can you keep snow and ice off of like your own solar panels? And is that a problem?
Okay. If this is a small scale distributed system like one at home, the answer is you don't. You just ignore it and lose the production for a day or two. It'll warm up, it'll melt off. It is not worth your risk to try to wipe these off, especially on a roof mount. You don't want to be on a roof. On a utility scale system, it's about the same. But because they tilt, when they tilt to their maximum amount and let that warm up, that snow doesn't last all that long. We'll need, in Nebraska, usually we get 2 or 3, 4 days of cold, and then finally it'll warm up. But by that time, we've got enough sun, it'll slough off. And so the answer is we lose a little production during that time, but we're not going to clean them off from snow and ice. We're just going to let that. But the higher the tilt angle, the faster that'll slough off. And because those can tilt, we can put those at a pretty high tilt angle. It'll let it slough off. And then once it's sloughed off, then the sun even gets in there better. So even some that's stuck, it'll melt off pretty rapidly.
That's a great question. I was wondering about that myself. But Sharon asks, so Lincoln Electric has only 2 wind turbines, correct? Yes. How many turbines would it take to power the entire city?
Yes and no, Sharon. That's the challenge. Okay, Lincoln Electric System owns and operates 2 wind turbines north of Lincoln. They actually purchase the output, though, from wind turbines in a whole wind farm, a whole or part of a wind farm in Oklahoma, whole or part of a wind farm in Kansas, and whole or part of a wind farm in Nebraska. So they actually have a lot of wind, but it is it's purchased wind from a private company where they purchased it in long term. So they essentially can be considered the owner, but they don't own and operate those. They only own and operate the 2. Now, how many wind turbines would it take to power all of Lincoln? That's a complicated question because it's not windy all the time. So if we tried to buy enough solar that could theoretically run all of Lincoln when it was running, we would need about 3 times what they own already. So they actually are about a third renewables. And so we could almost call that like almost a third wind. And so if they owned 3 more wind farms, they could then theoretically power the city of Lincoln. It would take quite a bit of that. But they would actually need, but from a legal is the wrong term, from a standpoint with the regulators, that LES is a member of the Southwest Power Pool, and they have to own or purchase qualified generation up to 112% of their peak load in a year. And so, the challenge with that with wind and solar is that wind and solar doesn't count as 100% qualified generation. So if you had a 100 megawatt wind farm, it only counts as 15% as qualified. 15 megawatts is qualified. So if we wanted to have all wind and solar and have it be qualified generation, we would have to own just a huge amount of wind and solar. So that doesn't happen. A lot of these utilities aren't picking that path. What they're doing is picking a path of, we're going to have some coal and natural gas that count as closer to 100% of theirs, and then a bunch of wind and solar to kind of make up a difference in there and to give us the low cost kilowatt hours. So a little complicated, I know, and I don't have the slides to back up and help explain that issue, but it has to do with the Southwest Power Pool and the complexity of those rules.
We have another one here. How do you anticipate that tax credit incentives will affect utilities' abilities to / motivation to build wind and solar farms?
Well, I think, what if I just hold, are you seeing my internet here?
Yes, we are.
SPP. Let's give maybe a visual on that, if this will load. Engineering, generation, connection. We're going to go to the interconnection, the generator interconnection queue line. This is the companies that have signed up to ask the regulator, the Southwest Power Pool, can we put generation on the grid and in what location? And this is taking longer to load than it should, but and it is amazing to see how much generation they are trying to put on the grid right now. And I think that this is a testament to say that not only has the subsidy helped improve and get people excited about wind and solar, but even the prices before the subsidy were enough to excite people. And if we filter this, let's just filter it by generation type. And we'll pick solar, and then maybe we'll pick wind after that. And so let's just pick solar. And it is going slow, but now every dot on this is solar. Look how many solar projects, there it is there. Look how many solar projects are proposed across that region. And in Nebraska, that equates to about 50,000 acres of solar proposed. Will that get built? No. But will part of it get built? Yes. How much? I'm not sure. But 50,000 acres of proposed solar projects in Nebraska. That's unbelievable. Wind projects. Let's switch to wind projects. Less numbers, but wind projects tend to be a little bigger in many ways, but a bunch of wind projects proposed in Nebraska as well. And these are described as the active queue requests. So I got to this website by going to the Southwest Power Pool's main page, clicking on engineering and generator interconnection. And the Southwest Power Pool is a regional transmission organization that all Nebraska utilities are a member of. And this is like a cooperation region is what this is, the Southwest Power Pool. Thanks for your question.
Well, we have one from Kathy. So has Nebraska committed to moving away from nuclear? It appears, according to statistics, to be one of the most clean forms of energy.
It is by statistics, it's one of the most clean forms of energy. By statistics, it is one of the safest forms of energy from a human death standpoint. Yet, we all know there are some major social challenges with it, which is public acceptance. And you had a question mark: is Nebraska moving away from nuclear? The answer is no. but the reality is everybody's moving away from nuclear because it's so hard to build a new nuclear power plant that eventually they're letting their old nuclear power plants eventually retire, because eventually you have to. I mean, the one we have is in Nebraska. We're very dedicated to running it for quite a few more years there in Brownville, Nebraska. But again, it's getting old, and it's eventually going to have to make a decision. Do I spend a bunch of money and re-up its contract for another 10 years or 15 or whatever, or do we let it retire? The answer across the United States is they're letting those retire slowly. So Nebraska has not gone away from nuclear, but they also haven't been dedicated to building a new one because it's so difficult and costly. Though there is a group of people in the state of Nebraska who are very excited about new renewable technology or new nuclear technology like modular reactors, and they're actually hosting a new advanced nuclear forum in Lincoln coming up in a couple months. I think it's coming up in May here in Lincoln, and it will be very interesting to see what kind of traction is being made with that, and could something like that happen. I'm going to prognosticate a tiny bit in my own kind of opinion, which is I don't see new nuclear power plants being in our future because of the cost and challenge of building them. At the same time, I could be wrong, and I'm very excited about this, about some of those new technologies and their safety, new safety things, and so we'll see what happens.
So Becky asks, how does a nonprofit go about getting solar energy installed or getting that? I think you talked about the tax benefits that they could receive from it.
Yeah, in the sense of getting it installed, if you had the money to install it, call a local installer. Make sure you get 2 or 3 quotes so you know which that you're getting a good price and getting a good installer. I can help you work through some of that, but also and then it's a matter of just getting it installed. That's not the difficult part. Actually, neither part is difficult. The second is, and the second part I don't know, which is because you're not a tax-paying entity, how do you get this tax credit? But the reality is there's going to be a form that you fill out and send to probably the IRS, and you get a check back. I don't think it's going to be all that difficult. It's just a matter of filling out their paperwork. If you are a tax-paying entity, it's simply a form on your taxes. It's pretty easy to get that back. So it's just a matter of getting it done and then applying for the tax credit. And I'm not sure that form has been fully written yet because we're kind of new into this new law. But a nonprofit would definitely need to have the funding to be able to do it. Whether some donor is donating to fund that solar, it's not. Maybe you could get a loan or something if that was something you were wanting to do, but you just simply would call an installer, maybe think about what kind of costs it might be. Solar is kind of scalable, meaning you don't have to build it to run your whole thing. You could build it to run half or a quarter of your load and just reduce the amount of power you buy. So if you're interested in kind of sizing that or thinking through that process, I'd be happy to talk to you.
We have 3 more questions here. One from Kathy. Do you have any recommendations on how to overcome neighborhood covenants against installing solar panels on a home?
Yeah, 2 very important ones. Neither of them are great. Number 1, talk. And see if you can get that changed over time just by, discussion and seeing if you get your covenant changed. Number 2 is there is a bill in the legislature right now that would force them to not disqualify or to allow it. And so you could also hope or support that bill and see where that's going in the legislature. You could follow that bill and see how it's doing. So.
All right. Then we have one from Sharon again. And she asks, do you know who is building the solar farm south of Lincoln? What is its current status, and will it benefit Lincoln?
I would change your question, Sharon, just a tiny bit. I wouldn't say the word building. I would say who is working to develop a solar farm in South Lincoln, because it's not built until they sell the electricity, essentially. And I haven't heard that they've sold that electricity. So the proposed company, I believe, is Nextera, I think, but don't quote me on that 100%, but I think that's who it is, which is a company out of Florida they're in the process of trying to lease some land. And then it goes from that phase to then getting a queue in the interconnection queue, and then it goes to getting it all approved by the county and the city. And then it goes to, once it's all done, then maybe if they sell the power, it gets built. In all those steps, it can stumble. So there's probably a dozen, maybe 24 projects proposed for every one that gets built. So I would say this is a proposed project. Will it benefit Lincoln? Yes, in many ways. Now, if there are people that might say, well, I have to live by it and I don't like it. Okay, that's also true, if that's your opinion. But from the Lincoln standpoint, the county will get the tax credit dollars, the tax dollars paid by the company as the capacity payment tax dollars in pretty significant amount of dollars. And then that'll go into the school system in the county. So it'll absolutely help Lincoln in that sense. Now, the electricity will flow into Lincoln. Absolutely, electricity will be used by the city of Lincoln. Will it be purchased by the city of Lincoln? That's an unknown. It is perfectly acceptable to sell that electricity across that whole Southwest Power Pool region, but it does tend to be that the companies tend to sell it a little closer to home in many cases, except for Lincoln buying in Oklahoma, which they did for economic reasons. And so we'll see who buys it. And I don't know who's going to buy it or if it'll get bought. I know the one east of Lincoln has been struggling to sell. And I'm only saying that because they haven't sold as much as I've heard, and it's been a bunch of years. So I'm not speaking of that like I know anything other than I'm watching and not seeing anything happen.
All right, then we have one last question here from Alexander. Can a person who operates a solar business find land to broker an agreement with the power company if the land is approved for use?
I'm not understanding that question at the moment. Let me think about that for a second.
And
I think I'll need more information to try to answer that. I'm struggling a little bit. For a utility scale project, let's say it's solar, because you said solar. The developer, the solar business, the developer is trying to lease land from the landowner. And the requirements for them to be able to use that land or not use it are within the rules of zoning within that county. And within the city of Lincoln, or if you're close to the city of Lincoln, you have to go to the city. If you're close to Lincoln, if you're far enough away from Lincoln, you go to the county. And if you're in other parts of the state, you go to the county and work through those zoning rules. And then you're working with the utility because the power is going on their lines. But the reality is that who dictates kind of if it can go on the power grid or not is the Southwest Power Pool, not the utility. But the utility might be a buyer of that electricity. And so that's where you're going to want to work with all the utilities around that you can to see who is willing to buy. That gets kind of complicated because depending on what your goals are or what your business model is, because the other option then is to just not sell the electricity in a long term, but to sell it on the spot market. And if Alexander, you're talking about small scale systems, what I just said doesn't mean anything. It's completely different. But that'd be large scale systems in a nutshell, but a little more complex than that.
And then, okay, we're gonna sneak one more in here from Tom. If solar and wind turns turns out to be cheaper per megawatt hour, do you foresee electricity prices for homeowners to go down?
Yes and no. How do you like that? The answer is that they will go down, but we as consumers probably won't see them go down, because what will happen in some ways is as that electricity becomes cheaper, but we have inflation over time, and the dollar is worth less. So what will likely happen is as a utility, especially in Nebraska, as that utility gets lower and lower cost electricity through wind and solar, they can then not raise our rates. I don't really see probably a trend where our rates will go down. The federal government has predicted that the price of electricity per kilowatt hour, the price of energy, will decline over the next 5 and 10 years. That was a prediction, the per kilowatt hour energy portion, but that's just the energy portion, not the delivery, because then we have all the maintenance of power lines. And the fact is we've had some inflation this last year or so. That's gotten more expensive. So as the maintenance of the power lines got more expensive, the delivery got expensive, but the electricity itself got cheaper. So the reality is, yes, electricity will get cheaper. It has gotten cheaper, but we're not going to see that, but we will see it in hopefully a slower increase trend of rising of prices. So that's kind of what I'm seeing in the data right now.
All right. Well, that looks like the end of our questions. Steve says, thank you for an informative presentation. And I'm going to have to agree. Thank you for coming and doing this. This is a really good time. If you want to plug your contact info again at the end, in case anyone else has any questions or anything, that would be great.
Will do.